Henry Rathbone spent less than 30 minutes beside Abraham Lincoln on the night of April 14, 1865. That half hour would destroy the next 46 years of his life, because when the president was shot, sitting close enough to touch, Henry Rathbone came to believe, with a certainty that never once loosened its grip on him, that it was his fault. To understand why that belief consumed him, you have to understand the night itself and the man sitting beside the president almost by accident. By the spring of 1865, the Civil War was effectively over. Robert E. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox 5 days earlier, and Washington was celebrating a peace that had cost the country more lives than any war before or since. Lincoln, exhausted after 4 years of leading a divided nation, told his cabinet that same week that he wanted reconciliation, not revenge. That evening, worn down but in unusually good spirits, he decided to attend a comedy at Ford's Theater. It was supposed to be the happiest night of his presidency. Henry Reed Rathbone was not supposed to be there at all. A wealthy New Yorker and a decorated Union Army major who had survived some of the war's bloodiest battles, he was engaged to Clara Harris, the daughter of a senator and a close friend of Mary Todd Lincoln. The president had originally invited General Grant and his wife to join them that night. Grant declined. The invitation passed almost as an afterthought to Henry and Clara instead. Years later, Rathbone would replay that exact invitation and the carriage ride that followed thousands of times in his mind, convinced there had been a moment buried somewhere inside it, a decision, a delay, a door when he could have changed what history already knew was coming. The carriage ride to the theater was almost cheerful. Crowds along the street cheered as it passed, word already spreading that the president himself was riding by. Lincoln talked with Mary about a trip out west they hoped to take once his term ended, the two of them speaking, witnesses later recalled, more like a young couple than a president and first lady worn down by 4 years of war. Inside the theater, the audience rose and the orchestra played Hail to the Chief as the president took his seat in the flag-draped box above the stage. Rathbone and Clara sat beside him. Lincoln laughed at the play's jokes. At one point, he reached over and took his wife's hand. It was an ordinary, happy evening, the kind that only exists in the last hour before something terrible happens. And in that box, for one final stretch of time, nobody had any idea what was coming. While the Lincolns settled in to enjoy the play, another man was already moving quietly through the theater's hallways. John Wilkes Booth was one of the most famous actors in America, a member of a celebrated theatrical family, and a devoted Confederate sympathizer who had spent months plotting to kidnap the president before the Confederacy's collapse turned that plan into something far more permanent. Booth knew Ford's Theater intimately, every hallway, every angle, every door, having performed on its stage many times himself. That familiarity now worked entirely in his favor. The single guard assigned to protect the president that night was, for reasons never fully explained, away from his post. Booth slipped into the narrow passage behind the presidential box and quietly jammed the outer door shut behind him with a wooden bar he had planted there earlier that day. Inside, the play continued toward one of its biggest laugh lines. Booth seems to have timed his entrance for that exact moment, using the sound of the audience's laughter to cover his approach. He stood only a few feet behind the president, close enough to hear him breathing. The box was dim, lit mostly by the glow spilling up from the stage below. Lincoln never turned around. He was watching the play, still smiling faintly at the line the actors had just delivered, his hand resting near Mary's. Booth raised a small Derringer pistol, a weapon built for exactly one shot and nothing more. For a moment, nothing happened. The laughter from the audience was still rolling through the theater. Then, in one motion, he fired. A single gunshot cracked through that laughter. For a fraction of a second, almost no one in the theater understood what the sound had even been. Then Rathbone spun toward it and saw Booth standing in a drifting cloud of gun smoke, the pistol still in his hand. Rathbone lunged at him without hesitation. The two men grappled violently in the cramped space of the box. Booth dropped the pistol and drew a large knife. As Rathbone grabbed for him, Booth slashed downward, opening a deep wound in Rathbone's left arm, narrowly missing the artery. Blood poured from the cut almost immediately. Despite that, Rathbone did not let go. For several seconds, in the dark, bleeding heavily, he very nearly stopped him. Booth tore free and vaulted over the box's railing, dropping to the stage roughly 12 feet below. His spur caught the flag draped over the balcony as he fell, and he landed hard, fracturing a bone in his leg. He staggered upright anyway, turned to face the stunned audience, and shouted the words that would follow him into every history book written afterward. Sic semper tyrannis, thus always to tyrants. Then he vanished through the wings, into the alley, onto a waiting horse, and into the dark. Inside the box, everything after that happened at once and also seemed to take forever. Mary Todd Lincoln screamed. Clara Harris rushed toward her, and Henry Rathbone, blood running down his arm and pooling on the floor, tried desperately to reach the door, the very door Booth had barred shut only moments before, the door that had cost precious seconds no one in that box would ever get back. Doctors from the audience reached the box within minutes and understood immediately that the president's wound was fatal. Lincoln was carried across the street to the Peterson house and laid diagonally across a bed too short for his frame. Rathbone remained behind, soaked in blood. Not all of it was his own. Through the night, Lincoln's cabinet and family gathered around him. He never regained consciousness. At 7:22 the following morning, April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton is said to have spoken the words that would close that chapter of American history. Now he belongs to the ages. For the country, that was the end of the story. Lincoln was mourned by millions, his funeral train carrying his body slowly through city after city so the public could grieve in person. Booth was hunted down 12 days later and killed in a Virginia barn, still convinced to his last breath that history would remember him as a hero. The nation, having just celebrated the end of one horror, now grieved another. But for Henry Rathbone, the story was only beginning. What followed wasn't another chapter of American history. It was the slow destruction of a man who could never escape a single night. Rathbone's arm healed. The scar and the nerve damage never fully went away, but physically, he recovered well enough to return to his military duties and eventually to something resembling an ordinary life. What never recovered was something no doctor of that era had any name for. Hill became convinced immediately and permanently that he had failed, that he should have reached Booth 1 second sooner, that his hesitation, his inability to force open a door that had already been barred against him, had cost the president his life. At first, it looked like grief. Then it looked like guilt. Then, slowly, over years, it began to look like something else entirely, something that had no real name yet in the medicine of the era, something closer to a haunting than a diagnosis. In 1867, he married Clara Harris, the woman who had lived through the same 20 minutes he had, the only other person on earth who understood exactly what that night had sounded like, smelled like, felt like. For a while, it seemed almost natural, two survivors finding shelter in each other. They had 3 children. From the outside, it looked like recovery. From the inside, it was the opposite. Rathbone grew withdrawn, then irritable, then given to sudden explosions of rage that came from nowhere and terrified those around him. He became convinced, without any evidence at all, that Clara was being unfaithful, an accusation that made no sense to anyone who knew them, and one he repeated again and again regardless. Friends described him as a man being slowly hollowed out from within by a memory he could not put down and could not stop reliving, as though the theater box had never actually let him leave it. In 1882, hoping distance might succeed where time had failed, the family moved to Hanover, Germany, where Rathbone had accepted a position as a United States consul, a fresh title in a fresh country, as if geography alone could quiet what 2 decades of ordinary life had failed to. It did not help. Isolated in a foreign country, cut off from the few people who had once grounded him, his condition worsened by the month. He became convinced his own family was plotting against him, that the walls of his own house held some quiet conspiracy aimed at destroying him. The paranoia that had lived quietly beneath the surface for nearly 2 decades finally broke through completely, and there was no longer anyone close enough or brave enough to talk him back from it. On the night of December 23, 1883, nearly 19 years after he had bled onto the floor of a theater box trying to stop an assassin, Henry Rathbone suffered a complete psychological collapse. His children fled as he turned on Clara, the wife who had survived that first horrific night beside him, stabbing and shooting her as she tried to shield them from him. He turned the weapon on himself afterward, attempting to end his own life, and failed at that too. German authorities declared him legally insane. He was committed to an asylum for the criminally insane in Hildesheim, where he would remain for the rest of his existence, his mind never releasing him from that theater box, that door, that half a second. He died there in 1911, 46 years after the assassination, having outlived Lincoln by nearly half a century and having spent almost every one of those years as a prisoner of a single unbearable memory. Millions of people know the name Abraham Lincoln. Streets carry it, monuments carry it, an entire memorial in the nation's capital carries it forward for as long as the country exists. Almost nobody remembers the name Henry Rathbone, the decorated Union officer who fought through some of the war's deadliest battles, who came within a single instant of stopping one of the most consequential assassinations in American history, and who lost absolutely everything in the decades that followed one ordinary invitation to the theater, an invitation he never asked for and could never take back. For the rest of his life, Henry Rathbone believed that if he had moved just 1 second sooner, Abraham Lincoln might have lived. Whether that was true, no one can say for certain. The door was barred before he ever had the chance. The seconds were never really his to lose. But Henry Rathbone never stopped believing it. Not for the rest of his life did that belief ever loosen its hold on him. History remembers the president who died in that theater. It rarely remembers the man seated beside him, the one who survived the bullet and spent the rest of his life unable to survive the memory of it. Thanks for watching. If you want more stories like this one, stories of the people history forgot, standing right beside the people it never will, subscribe to Dead Empires.